The announcement did not come through any official palace channel. There was no press release, no statement from a communications team, no briefing offered to royal correspondents in advance. What happened instead was considerably more in keeping with the way Catherine, Princess of Wales, tends to handle the things that matter most to her. It happened quietly, during an engagement that had been on the calendar for weeks, and the significance of what she chose to share became clear only in the days that followed, as the people inside the household worked out what it meant that she had said it at all. Catherine was speaking at a reception connected to one of her long-standing charitable commitments. The event was not designed to generate news. It was the kind of private engagement that appears in the official diary without drawing significant attention, attended by a small number of people with genuine connections to the cause, rather than by journalists or cameras positioned for broadcast. The audience was, by the standards of royal engagements, an intimate one. In the course of her remarks, Catherine mentioned Queen Elizabeth. This in itself was not unusual. References to the late Queen appear in royal speeches with some regularity, particularly when the subject matter has a historical dimension or when the speaker is acknowledging a legacy of service. What was unusual was the specific nature of what Catherine said, and the fact that she said it in this setting, at this moment, without any prior indication that she intended to. She told the people in that room that Queen Elizabeth had left personal items specifically for George, Charlotte, and Louis, not as part of any formal bequest process, not through any institutional arrangement, but in the form of deliberate and documented personal gifts tied to each child individually, with handwritten notes from the Queen explaining the significance of each one. Catherine described the notes as among the most meaningful things her children would ever possess, not for their material value, but for what they communicated about how Elizabeth saw each of them, what she observed in them, and what she hoped for each of them as they grew. She did not disclose the contents of the notes. She did not describe the items in detail. She spoke about them in terms of the emotional reality of receiving them, of sitting with her children as they read words written by their great-grandmother, and of what it meant to the three of them to understand that Elizabeth had taken the time, in the last period of her life, to write something intended specifically for them. The people in that room understood they were being told something that had not been shared publicly before. Several of them described in accounts that reached people familiar with the situation in the days that followed, a quality of attention in the room that was different from the kind that attends ordinary royal remarks. The audience was listening in the way people listen when they understand that what they are hearing is not prepared language, but something the speaker chose to say in that particular moment, because it felt right to say it there. Inside the household, the response to the account of what Catherine had said was more complicated than straightforward sentiment. The items Elizabeth left for the children, and the fact that they existed, were known to a relatively small number of people. The bequest process for a monarch of Elizabeth's tenure is an extensive and carefully managed undertaking. The formal elements of that process, the items connected to the Crown estate and the royal collection, are administered through established institutional channels with detailed documentation. What sits alongside the formal process is something considerably less visible: the private gifts, the personal objects, the things a person chooses to set aside for specific individuals with the specific intention that those individuals and no one else should receive them. Elizabeth had been precise about this distinction throughout her reign. She understood the difference between what belonged to the institution she served and what belonged to her privately, and she exercised that distinction with care. The items she designated for the children were private in that specific sense. They were hers to give, and she gave them to the people she chose. The handwritten notes that accompanied those items were, if anything, more significant than the objects themselves. Elizabeth was not known for demonstrating personal warmth through public gesture. Her emotional register in public settings was formal, disciplined. the product of a lifetime of understanding that the public display of feeling was something a monarch managed rather than expressed freely. What she communicated through formal channels and official occasions was always shaped by what the institution required. What she wrote in those notes was not shaped by what the institution required. It was shaped by what she actually thought about 3 children she had watched grow from infancy, had held at their christenings, had observed at close range across the family occasions that bring this family together year after year. She watched George learn to walk. She watched Charlotte develop the particular quality of directness that people who know the family describe as strikingly evident in her even at a young age. She watched Louis arrive into the family and establish himself in the way youngest children do, as something that took everyone slightly by surprise in the best possible way. The notes she left for each of them reflected those observations. They were not generic expressions of affection or formal acknowledgments of their place in the succession. They were specific to each child, in the way that something written by a person who has been paying attention over years is specific. They contained the kinds of details that only someone who was actually watching would think to record. Catherine's decision to mention these notes publicly, even in the limited way she did, was not made lightly. People who know her describe her approach to decisions about what to share and what to protect as genuinely considered, particularly when the subject involves her children. She is exceptionally careful about the line between the public dimension of her role and the private reality of her family's life. She has maintained that line consistently throughout 15 years of public exposure, in circumstances that would have tested most people's capacity to do so. The fact that she mentioned the notes in that room on that occasion without apparent premeditation suggests something about where her thinking was when she walked into the engagement that evening. She was not deploying information for a strategic purpose. She was talking about something that was genuinely present in her mind, and it found its way into her remarks because the context made it feel like the right thing to say. The engagement had been connected to work around child welfare and the particular challenges facing young people who navigate loss, transition, and the experience of being seen or not being seen by the significant adults in their lives. The thematic connection to what Elizabeth had done for her grandchildren, the act of taking care to see each of them specifically and record what she observed, was not a coincidence. Catherine recognized the resonance and allowed it to shape what she said. William learned what Catherine had shared before the account reached the household more broadly. His response, according to sources familiar with the sequence of events, was not one of concern about what had been disclosed, but something rather different. He had been present when the children first received the items and the notes. He had watched them read their great-grandmother's words. What Catherine had described in that room was something he had witnessed directly, and his primary response to learning she had spoken about it was recognition rather than alarm. The items themselves remained private. The specific objects Elizabeth chose for each child have not been described in any public account, and are not going to be described here. What can be said, based on accounts from sources familiar with the bequest process, is that the selections were characteristic of Elizabeth in their precision. She did not give things that were simply valuable or historically significant in an abstract sense. She gave things that connected specifically to each child. Things that had a meaning attached to them that went beyond the object itself. Things she believed each of them would eventually understand the significance of, even if that understanding would come in stages as they grew older. The note for George was the longest. He is the eldest, the one who carries the particular weight of knowing from an early age what his position in this family means and what it will eventually require of him. Elizabeth's note for him, according to people who know its general character, addressed that weight directly. She did not soften the reality of what his life will involve. She also did not reduce him to the role he will one day occupy. She wrote about him as a person, about things she had observed in him that she wanted him to know she had noticed, and about what she believed those qualities would mean for him as he moved through his life. For Charlotte, who carries a different kind of visibility within the family, and who has developed, even at her age, a particular quality of self-possession that people around the family remark on consistently, the note reflected what Elizabeth saw in her. Charlotte has been compared to Elizabeth in terms of both temperament and bearing by people who observed both women at close range. Whether or not that comparison is precise, it points to something observable. And Elizabeth, who spent a lifetime paying close attention to the people around her, would have observed it too. For Louis, the youngest, the note reflected the specific quality of attention you give to a child who you know may grow up with less direct understanding of what this family is and what it demands, because the weight of it falls most heavily on the ones before him. What Elizabeth wrote for Louis was shaped by an awareness that he would come to his own understanding of his position through his own particular path, and she addressed that path in terms that were specific to him rather than to the role of third child in a royal family in the abstract. Catherine, carrying these notes in her awareness, having watched her children encounter them, having sat with George and Charlotte and Louis as they read words from a woman who was no longer alive to tell them directly what she saw in them, is part of the daily emotional reality of her life in a way that does not appear in any official schedule or any public account of her work. The decision to mention them at that reception was an act of genuine disclosure. Not disclosure of the contents, not disclosure of the objects, but disclosure of the fact of them and of what they meant to her children in the moment they received them. That is a meaningful distinction. She protected what needed protecting and shared what she felt in that room with those people on that evening was worth sharing. The palace's response to the account of what Catherine had said was, in the days that followed, to say nothing at all. This is consistent with the institution's general approach to matters that are genuinely private, which is to treat the absence of official comment as the appropriate position. There is no statement to make about a private bequest, about handwritten notes from a dead queen to her great-grandchildren, about what a woman chose to leave behind for specific people in the last period of her life. The institution understands the difference between what it needs to address and what it needs to leave alone. What the disclosure did within the household and among the people who understood what it meant was to shift something in the way the story of Elizabeth's relationship with the next generation is understood. The formal record of Elizabeth's reign is extensive, meticulously documented, and will be studied for generations. The informal record, the things she chose to say and do within the private dimensions of her family's life, is considerably harder to access. What Catherine shared at that reception was a fragment of that informal record. Not the record itself, not the contents of the notes, but the fact of them and the quality of attention they represented. She told the people in that room that Elizabeth had taken the time in the last period of her life to see 3 children specifically, and to record what she saw in terms that were meant for them alone. That is not a small thing. The formal dimensions of Elizabeth's reign are its most visible legacy. The Treaty of Accession, the constitutional instruments, the decades of diplomatic relationships, the 62 prime ministers she worked with across her 70 years on the throne. These are the things that will appear in the histories and the biographies and the archival records that scholars will be reading 200 years from now. The handwritten notes for George and Charlotte and Louis will not appear in those records. They are private. They belong to the children who received them, and they will remain with those children. But they are part of the legacy too, perhaps the most human part of it. The part that reflects not the institution Elizabeth served, but the person she was within that institution and the relationship she maintained with the family that surrounded her in the private dimensions of her life. Catherine understood that. She understood it in the moment she mentioned it, and she understood what she was choosing to share and what she was choosing to protect. The people in that room heard something real from her, not a prepared statement, not a managed disclosure, not a strategic communication, something she chose to say because it felt true to the occasion and the people in front of her. The palace said nothing. The household adjusted its understanding of what Catherine had shared and why. And the children whose great-grandmother wrote those notes are growing up in possession of something that belongs to them specifically and to no one else. Not to the institution, not to the historical record, not to any future biography of Queen Elizabeth II, to George, to Charlotte, to Louis. That is how Elizabeth intended it. Catherine made sure people understood that it had happened. The question of why Elizabeth chose to leave things in this particular way, through handwritten personal notes attached to specific objects, rather than through any of the many formal channels available to her, reflects something consistent with what people who worked closely with her over many years describe as her understanding of the difference between what the institution required and what she personally owed to the people she cared about. Elizabeth spent 70 years navigating that distinction with extraordinary precision. The institutional dimension of her life was managed through established processes, documented carefully, administered through the appropriate channels. The personal dimension was managed through the kinds of actions that leave no institutional record: a handwritten note, a phone call made without staff present, a visit arranged quietly, a small gesture that communicated something that no official communication could have conveyed. This is not unusual for someone in her position. People who operate at the intersection of a powerful institution and a personal life develop over time a very clear sense of which dimension governs which actions. Elizabeth had been developing that sense since she was a young woman and had refined it across 7 decades of managing one of the most scrutinized public roles in the world. She knew exactly what belonged to the institution and what belonged to her. And she was precise about maintaining that distinction even in the last period of her life, when the energy required to be precise about anything was itself a limited resource. The choice to write the notes by hand was part of that precision. A typed document belongs to a different category of communication than a handwritten one. A typed document implies systems, staff, processes. A handwritten note implies a person sitting alone with paper and pen, choosing each word without assistance, making something that belongs to the relationship between the writer and the recipient, and to no one else. Elizabeth understood that distinction, and she chose the form that reflected what she intended. For George, the note had the character of something written by someone who had thought carefully about what a child in his particular position carries, and who wanted to address that weight directly rather than around it. People who are aware of its general character describe it as honest in a way that reflects Elizabeth's known directness, and also as warm in a way that reflects something she rarely displayed publicly. She was not, in the official record, a person whose warmth was frequently visible. In the note to her eldest great-grandchild, who carries more than any child should have to carry, it appears she chose differently. The note for Charlotte reflects a different quality of attention. Those who have some awareness of it describe it as observational in a specific way, as if Elizabeth had been watching Charlotte for years and had found things worth recording precisely because they were not things that anyone had specifically told her to notice. Charlotte has developed a quality of self-possession that is remarked on consistently by people who encounter the family in both formal and informal settings. Elizabeth, who understood self-possession better than almost anyone, would have recognized it and known what it means in a life like the one Charlotte is living. For Louis, who arrived into this family after several of the defining events of recent royal history had already occurred, who is growing up in a household that has been shaped by pressures and losses his older siblings experienced but that he came to later, the note reflects an awareness of his particular path through a childhood that is, by any ordinary measure, far from ordinary. Elizabeth had watched 3 Wales children grow up across the years she was alive to watch them, and she understood that each of them had their own relationship with what this family is and what it asks of the people who are born into it. Louis's relationship with all of that is his own, and she addressed him on those terms. Catherine, carrying all of this in her awareness, while managing the daily reality of raising 3 children in the particular circumstances that surround them, is part of what shapes her understanding of her own role. She is not simply a public figure performing a function. She is a parent raising children who are growing up in a situation that has very few precedents, in possession of things from a person they loved and have lost, trying to ensure that the weight of what their lives will involve does not prevent them from being children for as long as they are children. When she mentioned the notes at that reception, she was not speaking as the Princess of Wales making a considered institutional communication. She was speaking as a parent who had sat with her children in a moment of genuine emotional significance and who found, in that room with those people on that evening, that it felt right to acknowledge that the moment had happened. The response from within the palace, the conspicuous absence of any official comment, reflects the institution's recognition that there is nothing here for the institution to manage. This was not a strategic disclosure, not a communication designed to produce any particular effect on public perception of the family or its relationships. It was a person saying something true about her children and their great-grandmother in a context that made it feel appropriate to say. The people who were in that room heard it as it was meant. They understood they had been given something real, something that belonged to the private dimension of a family they see mostly through the managed surface of official occasions. They did not treat the knowledge carelessly, and the account of what Catherine said that evening traveled through channels that preserved, at least initially, the quality of discretion the disclosure had been made in. That the household eventually became aware of it is inevitable. Nothing said in a room of that size, at an engagement of that kind, remains entirely contained. But the way it became known, through careful account rather than through leak or briefing, reflects something about the environment Catherine has built around her own public engagements. One in which people who are in the room with her treat what she says with the same care that she herself brings to what she chooses to say. There is one element of the story that perhaps carries more weight than any of the others, and it is the simplest one. Elizabeth, in the last period of her life, with the particular clarity that comes when a person understands that their time is limited, sat down and wrote 3 separate notes for 3 specific children. She did not write a general letter to the family. She did not leave a single message that addressed them collectively. She wrote to each of them individually about things specific to each of them, in a form that would survive her and reach them directly. That act of care, the choosing of specific words for specific people, in the knowledge that those words would matter to those people after she was gone, is as human a thing as any public figure of her stature has ever done. It belongs to no official record, and it reflects no institutional obligation. It reflects a person who loved the children in her family, and who found a way to tell them so in terms that would last. Catherine chose to let people know that had happened. Not the details, not the contents, not the specific words Elizabeth chose for each child. Just the fact of it, and what it meant to the children who received it. She let people know that Elizabeth, in the last period of her life, had seen George and Charlotte and Louis specifically, had written for them specifically, and had left something behind that belonged to them and to no one else. In a family whose public life is almost entirely managed through institutional channels, through official diaries and prepared statements and coordinated communications, that act of private care stands apart. It did not happen on camera. It did not generate any official record. It was not designed to produce any particular response from the public or the press. It was something Elizabeth did because she wanted to, for people she loved, in the particular form that felt most true to what she wanted to say. Catherine made sure the people in that room understood it had happened. The palace said nothing. The children are growing up in possession of words that belong to them. That is the whole of it. And it is enough. What remains, after the institutional silence and the careful accounts and the adjustments and understanding that followed, is something that cannot be neatly filed under any heading the palace uses for its own records. It is the story of a queen who knew she was dying and who chose, among the many things she could have done with her remaining time and energy, to write personal notes for her youngest great-grandchildren. It is the story of a mother who sat with her children when they read those notes and carried that experience with her into every subsequent day. And it is the story of a room where, on an evening when the subject of how children survive loss was already in the air, something true was said about the way one family holds that loss and what was left behind to help them carry it. The palace will continue to manage what can be managed. The institution will continue to function through the channels and processes that have sustained it across generations. And somewhere in the private households of the Wales family, 3 children are growing up in possession of something that was written for them by a woman who watched them closely and wanted them to know what she saw. That is Elizabeth's private legacy to the generation that follows her. Not the constitutional record, not the diplomatic history, not the archive that scholars will be reading for the next 2 centuries. The handwritten words she left for 3 specific people because she loved them and because she was precise, even in her final period, about what she owned personally and what she chose to give. Catherine let people know it had happened.